Joanna, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Joanna Leidenhag. I am a lecturer in theology and liberal arts at the University of Leeds in the UK. Been there about 2 years. Yeah.
Cool. So I invited you on to talk about theological panpsychism. What is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, this is the topic I did my PhD on. So panpsychism is the theory that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the universe. So it's everywhere, and it is the fundamental. It's basic. There's nothing below it. There's nothing it emerges out of or reduces down to. So it's kind of part of the fundamental makeup of the universe, is the claim. So that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. So that's the panpsychism bit. And then the theological panpsychism. So what's theological about it is I try and put that theory about consciousness into dialogue with different views about God, about spirituality, and specifically with the Christian faith.
And how exactly do you merge those two? Because I think it's very interesting to see the idea of Christianity be merged with the idea that consciousness is fundamental. Do you think that God is outside of space-time, is the typical like William Lane Craig kind of a view? Or do you think that to be able to have thoughts, the way I view it, that you need to be able to have some kind of transition through time? And so if consciousness was outside of time, would it still be consciousness in that sense?
Yeah, so I appeal to the Christian idea of creation out of nothing and the transcendence of God to suggest that when I talk about consciousness as fundamental and ubiquitous, I think it's good if you're a Christian and you're a panpsychist to then draw a distinction between the mind of God and the consciousness of the universe. So there'll be other theologians, including Christian ones actually, who would disagree with that and want to say that there's some kind of continuity between the fundamental consciousness that the universe is kind of built out of and God, right? To suggest that God is the fundamental stuff. And I want to draw a sharp distinction there and say that God actually made a universe of which consciousness is a fundamental part, so that God could be in relationship with that universe. I think that's a much better position to be in from the perspective of Christian theology. So that puts me more, as it were, on the traditional, as you called it, William Lane Craig side of things, though not in answer to the specific question around whether God is inside or outside time. I think that's just like a separate problem that I have not had time to think very hard or very long about, but yeah.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because when I was thinking of panpsychism in relation to Christianity, I was thinking God was the fundamental consciousness that everything was created out of. But you're saying that the universe has its own kind of consciousness foundation that God created that's separate from God.
Right. So just as the kind of really standard Christian story would be that there's God and then God creates everything, and some of that everything includes humans and human consciousness. So we've already got that kind of basic setup, and I'm actually only tweaking the creation side. I'm not tweaking the God side, right, of that traditional story. I'm just saying that when God creates the universe, God creates consciousness in everything at the start. But it's created consciousness that he creates, right? Not divine consciousness. Yeah.
So is there a conflict between souls and everything having consciousness, or does in some way gaining some higher level of consciousness, then that higher level gets a soul kind of a thing? Because I always see those two as consciousness and soul as kind of synonymous. And so if everything in the universe has like one consciousness, then does it all have one soul too?
Yeah, so I do also view consciousness and souls as synonymous, as just different language that we use today versus language people have used in the past for broadly the same thing. So in that sense, I would be equally happy to say everything has a soul. The question of the oneness, whether it's one soul, as it were, one consciousness, is slightly more complicated because there are different theories about panpsychism that will have different stances on that. So the panpsychism that I mostly develop in my book, which is called Mind in Creation, is a kind of mini panpsychist view, right? Sometimes called atomistic panpsychism, that there are lots and lots and lots of minds fundamentally, and those combine to create more complex minds, like in a human or another animal, or even maybe plants. But there are other theories of panpsychism that say actually the fundamental thing is just one massive cosmic mind, right? So Philip Goff's work is a good example of this in contemporary scholarship. He's moved towards a kind of what's called cosmopsychism, cosmic mind view. And so in that view, everything is one mind, and then that kind of fragments or decombines, splits up to create individuals, such as we experience our own mental lives in a kind of private sense most of the time. So I start with the kind of like built from many into more complex structures, much like we view material things, atoms and stuff. But that's not the only way you could be a panpsychist. And both of those are perfectly combinable with Christian theism. I just think the many atoms at the bottom one, the atomistic panpsychism that I go for, is easier to keep that distinction between God and creation that I'm wanting to keep. The other panpsychists might not want to keep, but I want to keep that in.
So would that mean that rocks also have souls? Because if everything has consciousness and there's a rock and that has consciousness, does that also have a soul?
Yeah, so on that view, rocks contain soul stuff, just like everything contains soul stuff. But as far as we know, and I think it's extremely likely, that rocks are not of the sufficiently complex structure, they're not integrated, they're not unified, such that their soul stuff hasn't unified to create a more complex, unified mind. So and I think it's probably along the lines of things that are living and things that aren't living, right? Living things are complex, integrated structures with feedback loops where different parts are sending nutrients or whatnot to other parts of the organism. So when you see a structure like that and we call it alive, I think that's plausible anyway, until maybe natural science can get some more traction on this theory and make progress with it, that the living things are also the consciously unified things, and unliving things, they contain bits of consciousness, just like all the atoms and electrons in the universe, but they're not unified sufficiently that we would say the rock as a whole, single rock, is conscious. We would just say the atoms of the rock are conscious, but there's nothing special about that for a panpsychist view.
So do dogs go to heaven?
Oh yeah, I definitely think so, though I don't think that's particularly linked to panpsychism. But yes, the kind of heaven, hell, eschatological, the end things result of this view is that everything has value, everything can be in relationship with God, everything is worth saving. Dogs, gerbils, and everything else. Yeah.
Right. So like once it becomes sufficiently complicated in life, then it has a soul. And so soul would seem to imply some kind of moral significance in the Christian faith. And so if there was a dog, for example, that was alive and had a soul, would it have the same moral obligations or implications of what soul happens to souls as human souls in the Christian ideology? Because I think many Christians think that only humans have souls and other animals don't, because they don't have the same kinds of obligations that would be entailed by following God's commands to get into heaven or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what this panpsychist view gives you is a good way to have gradient when it comes to souls. So it's not just if you got one or you're not, because everything's got one to some extent. It's just some have them in a more complex, unified sense. And with that comes an increased value, increased capacity perhaps for pain, and for love, and thus increased moral obligations, both to protect and moral responsibilities on that agent, right? So, and then that goes down. So dogs have some responsibilities, I think, but less than humans have. Likewise, they have moral value, but less than a human has when push comes to shove. Though I love dogs, so that's quite hard to say. But then that goes down all the way down to, so there's nothing in the universe that has absolutely no value, right? Because there's some modicum of soul stuffs everywhere, in every electron, in every quark, to answer a comment I saw come in. And so that has it's extremely minimal moral value as well. The key here is to think of it as a gradient, not just an overwhelming amount of moral responsibility that this view would put on you, because actually I think this is fairly intuitive for people anyway, that there is some, it might be absolutely tiny, but there's something there that's ethically valuable, ethically puts some sort of demand on us.
So why go with panpsychism at all? Why not be a materialist about the universe and say God created a material universe outside of himself?
So I think actually Christianity and other theisms are compatible with a whole variety of theories about consciousness, right? There's a reason that Christians have always debated this question, continue to debate this question. It's more than people realize. It's not, I don't think you have to be a dualist, or you have to be a panpsychist, or you have to be an idealist when you're a Christian. I think there are loads of different views, and you'll just have slightly different challenges depending on which of those theories of consciousness you opt for. One of the reasons I opt for panpsychism, therefore, are actually not primarily, the first reasons aren't theological reasons. They're philosophical reasons. They're the reasons any secular philosopher might opt for panpsychism. So a dissatisfaction with materialism as incapable of explaining the phenomenon of human consciousness, and a dissatisfaction with traditional dualism as well. And then thinking, okay, what views are left? There are some kind of non-reductive materialism, some emergence theories. There's things like holomorphism, and there's panpsychism. And so I just kind of surveyed those and thought that panpsychism was actually pretty, at least equally plausible and drastically underexplored and underappreciated as a possible explanation for consciousness in the universe, its place in the universe. And then after that, after those kind of philosophical reasons, looking a little bit as well at some science that's interested in it, some quantum science. I'm not a quantum physicist or a neuroscientist, but both those fields are starting to have a little bit of interest in panpsychism as a theory that might dovetail quite nicely with things going on there. But after kind of surveying those scientific and philosophical evaluations, as it were, of different theories of consciousness, then I thought, okay, well, if this was true, what does that mean for Christianity? And then I also think it's not a deal breaker, but it has some advantages. I think it helps us understand divine presence in the universe, because God can be present in the minds of all atoms, all things, everywhere. It helps us perhaps with, as we've already talked about, some ethical issues, particularly environmental issues, and helps the Christian faith have a really robust answer to that, or anyone who adopts this panpsychist view would, I think, have a more robust answer to that particular challenge today.
So what do you think about strong emergence?
Strong emergence? Yeah. So strong emergence, just in case listeners aren't familiar with it, right, is my understanding is the view that you start off with an entirely material universe. There's no consciousness at all. There's not even, I think, on strong emergence, really the predictable possibility of consciousness, right? So it just looks like a purely material universe. And then from that, in a kind of, they talk about radical novelty in an unpredictable way, consciousness emerges. It appears when a material world or particular material structure becomes sufficiently complex, sufficiently unified, in many of the same ways that I talked about the unifying of consciousness earlier. So the main difference between strong emergence and panpsychism, as I understand it, is panpsychism builds in the ingredients for complex consciousness at the bottom level, and strong emergence says, no, those ingredients aren't there, but still it can emerge as something new where there was nothing before. So I've set up those two distinctions in order, as I genuinely understand the two views, but to me, it becomes clear that the strong emergence view looks a bit like magic. It looks like pulling a rabbit out of a hat. The rabbit wasn't there before, but all of a sudden, wow, if we just wave things in the right way, we get a rabbit out of a hat. And I just don't think that's a very sufficient explanation. It's more of a narrative of like nothing, poof, something. And within the kind of time-space structure of the universe, where we're looking for those kinds of explanations, we're not bringing in any special divine action, any God that might otherwise explain what appears to be miraculous or magical. I think that's really unsatisfactory as an answer for where consciousness comes from. It just kind of, it's just like saying, oh, it's just there. It's one scholar put it, it's strong emergence is a restatement of the problem. It's not actually a solution. So that's what I think about strong emergence. And you can see that panpsychism is actually like a hair's breadth away. All I'm doing is putting in the ingredients from the beginning. Otherwise, much of the picture looks fairly similar.
Yeah, so I've had several conversations with Philip Goff, Bernardo Kastrup, some other idealists, and this is one of the things that I find the most interesting. I agree. I think strong emergence is like magic. It doesn't make any sense. But I don't see a very big difference between that and panpsychism or idealism, because I don't see why there's an epistemic advantage to putting it at the beginning as opposed to putting it in the middle. It seems like in both cases, it's the same thing where it doesn't actually solve the problem. It just says, oh, there's consciousness. It's just in this time t equals 0 versus t equals 50. And in either one, you haven't solved the problem of what consciousness is. You're just saying there is the thing. It's something and it's there. It's just at different points. And so I don't see any difference between the epistemic advantage of panpsychism over strong emergences. So I'm a weak emergence. I think it's there and there's something to it, and it's just the physical world. But I don't see why we would take panpsychism to be better than strong emergence.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it also my answer is going to tie into a comment made by someone called Dylan Motes here in the chat, which is that there's, I think, a reason when panpsychists like myself, as you say, Philip Goff, Kastrup, when they make this argument, I think what we're doing, which as a theist I'm very comfortable with, is backing ourselves into the corner of the cosmological argument for the existence of God, right? So we're wrapping up, we're saying we're dissatisfied with consciousness appearing like magic in the middle of creation. It's like having the punchline at the wrong place in a joke. The whole thing falls flat as an explanation. But if we put it at the beginning, if we set things up in the right way, then that's fine. Now, I like that, but that's because I've also got a separate reason for where that consciousness and everything else comes from, which is obviously where the cosmological argument or the existence of God comes in, right? That ultimately, consciousness, just like everything else, is explained by the divine will to create, and I think that's a better place to put it. It's just putting consciousness where you're putting everything else. So everyone still has the problem of, great, okay, consciousness is now just alongside matter, fundamental. It's like space-time. Where does that come from if you think that's created? Whatever you're thinking is there at the beginning, you're still going to have to kind of explain that. And I don't think panpsychists are trying to explain the existence of everything, right? They're just trying to explain the complexity and the kind of amazingness of human consciousness. And when you're narrowing the explanation to that, I think it's fine that panpsychism just says, well, we're going to build it in as a fundamental feature, or the building blocks or the ingredients, and then we're going to have to explain how it unifies, how it complexifies. We haven't got there yet. There's some kind of speculative theories to try and answer that. But we're not trying to explain where the universe comes from. That's not what panpsychism is about. But I do think panpsychism, by front-loading creation, as it were, by front-loading consciousness right to the beginning and making it fundamental, is backing itself towards something like having to bring in another explanation like God for where the universe comes from, particularly given that they're dissatisfied with the magic pop of emergence in creation. It should be also dissatisfying then to say, well, the universe just exists. You're going to have to bring in some other kind of explanation to explain how it exists. And obviously that's where I think God can come in.
Well, that's, I think, one of the things that I find the most challenging about panpsychism and idealism. It seems like if you're going to place some kind of entity, ontological thing that you think exists in the universe, the more fundamental that you place it in your ontology, I think the less, or the higher burden of proof that you have. I think it's less rational to put it as more fundamental. I think that's harder given like what we know about science. Pretty much everything we know about is emergent. And so if you want to find something more fundamental, it takes a higher burden of proof to do that. And so to place anything we have like consciousness or anything we discover as more fundamental seems to be the way we shouldn't do it. We should always probably say it's probably emergent of some kind. And then if we only put it as fundamental, in cases of absolute extreme kinds of cases like quantum fields or something where we just can't even investigate anything beyond that. But why would it be an advantage to try to put something fundamental? Because it seems like we should try that last. Like we should never do that under any circumstances as much as possible. Why would that be a good thing to do?
Well, I think so I do think, first of all, there are plenty of examples of people coming to panpsychism as a kind of last man standing argument. First off, like that is a common route to panpsychism. Everything else seems dissatisfying, so I'm going to try this instead. But I don't think it's quite as radically problematic to do that, or to make things fundamental as you suggest, right? So I think it would be problematic if we were making human consciousness fundamental, right? With all the bells and whistles, the cognitive capacities of a human mind, because that's what we're trying to explain. So if you're just saying, the thing I'm trying to explain, human consciousness, it just exists. That's not a very, as you say, that's not a very satisfactory explanation. I don't think that's what panpsychists are doing, because they're not saying that human consciousness is fundamental. They're saying that there's the stuff that human consciousness is made out of almost. I mean, stuff language is like materialistic-y language. It's difficult to get away from that. I don't have other vocabulary. But they're not saying that atoms are like humans and human consciousness has just always existed. I actually think this is the problem of the traditional dualist argument, where God just puts souls in human beings, ready-made, ready to go. It's not actually explaining human consciousness and the human connection with the embodiment and place in evolution, right? Whereas if you put consciousness in this more basic sense at the beginning, then just like you can have a material explanation for material things, right? For structures, how they're built, how they organize, how they exchange information. So too, the idea is you can have that for minds. And the other part of the panpsychist claim is that you will have roughly the same kind of pattern or basic explanation for minds as you will for bodies, because these two things aren't separate. They're one thing in everything, right? The universe is made out of psychophysical stuff, not mind stuff and material stuff that gets whacked together, but psychophysical stuff that was always one thing. So you're going to have the same kind of explanation. So if you're satisfied with scientific explanations, weak emergence, or basic other kind of combinationist, constructionist explanations for how things get built, how things combine, then you should find the panpsychist explanation equally satisfying for consciousness, because it's patterning itself on those reductive or weak emergencist explanations. It's just trying to do the same thing with consciousness as natural science does with matter. So it's the same, I think it's Philip Goff who said it's the same form of an explanation, right? So it's the same shape of an explanation. We haven't filled in all the details yet. But I do think it has potential for explanatory power, rather than just saying, oh, human consciousness just exists. Yeah.
Well, for me, the form of the explanation seems kind of like Aristotle's fundamental forces, fire, air, earth, water, where he takes something that we see in the macro world and then says, he thinks it's a fundamental essence in the universe. Says it's fundamental, but it seems like we could take this same form and do it with anything. Take a pineapple, for example. Say we're trying to explain pineapples. We can say there's this essence of pineappleness of the universe, and the essence of pineappleness can accumulate into a true pineapple once it gets to a sufficient pineappleness. But we all have pineappleness in us. Every particle does. Seems like we could take this same kind of methodology and apply it to literally anything, any essence that has ever been hypothesized about any philosopher. And so this methodology seems very risky to me because of how easy that we could apply it to literally anything we have, and the only thing holding it together is the fact that it can't be disproven yet. So we obviously haven't proven what consciousness is made of, but if there's anything that we haven't yet shown can be reduced to something else, we could say the same thing about it, that it is some kind of fundamental essence in the universe that has pseudo pineapple particles that then accumulate into pineapples. And so what would be, as a methodology, it seems we shouldn't be using the fact that it hasn't been disproven yet as a justification to say that it's fundamental any more than we could about anything.
Yeah, I think in one sense that's fine. It's just consciousness is a really hard problem, and I think there is an intuition here that consciousness is more different and will require a different kind of explanation to other things, right? So the reason the pineapple example is kind of, in what we might say, powerful, but a good choice, right, is because it's so clear that we shouldn't explain pineapples that way. But I think it's still a bit. I don't think I even have to reply that much, because pineapples just obviously aren't the same sort of things as consciousness, right? First of all, like we have perfectly satisfactory explanations for other things, for just about everything else. Actually, I can't think of any other example other than consciousness that has baffled philosophers and scientists for so long, and also we have such irrevocable proof exists, right? We know consciousness exists more than we know anything else exists, more than we know the sun exists, more than we know we're having this conversation, more than we know that the past exists, right? Consciousness is the absolute primary and the only real certain datum that exists, right? For all the things Descartes was wrong about, he was right about that. And so that seems to me to be the sort of thing, therefore, that is actually a good candidate for fundamentality. If anything is, then actually this is. And it's kind of more bizarre that we ever thought otherwise, that we ever thought that we might be able to get this primary basic datum of existence that we know exists more than anything else out of the stuff that we actually is a little bit more mysterious to us, right? Matter is more mysterious to us than consciousness is.
Oh, sure. I think from like an epistemic view, we directly start with consciousness, epistemic solipsism. I think therefore I am, but I don't see why that matters. I don't see like why it's relevant that our first piece of data is consciousness. Like the order at which we gain information doesn't seem to be that important to making an argument of fundamentality. So let's say I'm trying to see or a computer is trying to see a galaxy, and the only way it can see a galaxy is through a telescope. Does that mean that the telescope pre-exists to the galaxies? Well, no, it's just a means that we need to be able to gain knowledge of the galaxy.
Yeah.
And the same thing could be true of the external world. So we need consciousness to be able to gain knowledge of the external world, because if we're not conscious, we don't know anything. But why? I don't see any logical entailment that because we start with consciousness, we should therefore be more rational to infer that it's more basic, any more than the case of because we can't see a galaxy without a telescope, we must assume the telescope is more basic.
Yeah, I do think, yeah, we're more certain that the telescope exists in that example than we are that the galaxy exists in your example. And that doesn't mean that temporally the telescope pre-exists the galaxy. And I don't think I'm inferring that kind of temporal, like from epistemic to temporal, right? So fundamentality isn't primarily or always about which thing existed first, though I get that that's a common correlate of saying that something is more fundamental. Yeah, and I suppose I'm not saying that consciousness is more fundamental such that matter comes out of it either, right? So I think that both matter. So you could be an idealist panpsychist, as I know you've had on this show. I'm actually more of a, like the easiest way to put it, though I don't really like it, is like a dualist all the way down, right? This psychophysical stuff, so mental stuff and material stuff are both fundamental, but they're one thing, not two things. And yeah, so I don't even know. You started off by asking me why I think it's fundamental, right? Why is that a satisfactory explanation?
Oh, let me rephrase slightly. So I think
Yeah.
the problem I have is that starting with the fact that we know consciousness exists first, I don't think gives us any indication of where in the hierarchy of existence it is. I don't think the epistemic fact that we use it to do anything tells us anything about where it exists in the universe. But that seems to be a fundamental argument in panpsychist idealists, all the different versions of consciousness, that the fact that we know about consciousness more than anything else because we have direct experience of it is some kind of a tool that we can use to indicate where it exists on the hierarchy of things. And I don't see the connection between those two arguments.
Yeah, I actually think that's fair. I think that we know it, we have primary experience of it, as it were, is a really powerful argument against like annihilationists about consciousness, if that makes sense, or
the eliminativists,
functionists and liminativists. Yeah. So I think it's a really powerful argument against that. I think it can be a powerful argument against some very close to that, right, reductive materialists, because it's just a way of saying it is undeniable that consciousness exists, right? And I think that's the role of this argument. And so I think I almost just want to concede that that's the role of this argument, that argument doesn't then make the step to where consciousness exists in the universe. I don't think the fact that it's undeniable that it exists entails that it exists fundamentally. I think that has to be built in by a separate argument. So I think I'll just concede that point, because I think you're right about that.
So why should we, simply because we don't have an explanation, should we then infer for anything we don't have an explanation, or is that really puzzling to us, that it's fundamental? Because to me, that seems very much like the structure of an argument from ignorance kind of a thing. We can't explain it. It puzzles us. Therefore, it's fundamental. And I don't see that the fact that we can't explain it or that it's puzzling to us would also seems like it would not be a justification to infer it's fundamental simply because we can't explain it. And so is there Would you agree
Yeah.
with that? Would you disagree with that? And is there any other
I
reason to
do
think it's
think we should
fundamental?
be restrained, right, in what we claim is fundamental. I think, and yeah, I think that's right. I just find, and I suppose I should find a better way of articulating why, but I just find that to say that consciousness is doesn't appear to be unrestrained to me, right? It appears to be. I can't prove it, right? There's no hard and fast proofs here, but I find it to be still a responsible choice given how difficult it is to explain consciousness. And as we said before, this kind of like, not quite last man standing, but dissatisfaction with other explanations about how consciousness appears in the universe. Now, panpsychism doesn't stand, it in one sense stands in competition with these other views, but I wanted to add earlier on that I think it's compatible with some views as well, right? So it's compatible with a dualism or an idealism. Galen Strawson thinks it's compatible with a materialism. I'll leave that one for him to defend. I definitely think it's compatible with weak emergence, right? So you've got these ingredients built in at the bottom, and that helps to explain how it can be that you get more complex structures through a kind of weak emergence of consciousness. So other people want to attach it to strong emergence, though I think that becomes slightly superfluous. But it is both. It's both a kind of view in its own right that's like trying to fend off these other explanations, but it's also can be phrased, and I think perhaps more compellingly, as an ingredient to be combined with other explanations or other theories of consciousness out there.
So the first part of the argument makes sense to me. I understand what it means, like the fact that consciousness is really complicated, we can't understand it. But that one I don't see as any kind of a justification for inferring anything. I think that the fact that we can't explain it tells us nothing, just like the fact that we epistemically know about it first also tells us nothing about where it's located in the hierarchy of ontology. The second one I don't understand exactly. You think you had like an intuition or something, I don't remember the word you used, that tells you that consciousness is more fundamental. And to me, those two seem to be like the primary 2 or 3 arguments for why people who believe consciousness is so significant. That's the first thing we know about. It can't be explained. It's very confusing. And there's this intuition. The first two don't seem to like logically entail anything about where the hierarchy is. And the third one I don't really see as any different than just like an intuition about anything being fundamental.
Yeah,
And
so
so,
I don't have the intuition that consciousness is fundamental. I don't think that's right. If I said that earlier, I apologize.
oh no, I was trying to use a word to be an analogy to what you said. I don't remember exactly the word you said.
Yeah, no, I have an intuition that consciousness, the intuition part was that consciousness cannot be explained, as it were, by in a purely materialistic way, right? That it can't be explained through in exclusively what we might think of as third-person mathematical or structural explanations by which we explain that's how we explain material things. That even when we do that, we'll be missing something absolutely essential to the nature of what consciousness is, and thus be not really explaining the thing we're trying to explain. So we can, on this theory, we can know everything there is possibly to know about brains and how they work, and that would be extremely helpful for understanding consciousness. But if those kind of mathematical structural explanation of the brain was all we knew, then we still would be missing something of what it's like to be, right? This is the popular language from Thomas Nagel of what it's like to be conscious, what it's like to have that particular brain, to be that kind of brain. Mathematical and structural explanations would never get us that. Certainly they can be extremely helpful for lots of things. I don't want to deny that. But there would be this kind of core ingredient to the nature of consciousness missing, of that kind of qualitative feel of what it is to be like. So my intuition is that intuition that we need something more than purely physicalist explanations. The intuition is not, therefore, that we have to make it fundamental. That becomes through kind of like, okay, what are we going to do with that? Where can we go? We've got these emergence views. The strong one looks too unsatisfactory to me. I do think the weak emergentist one is probably right, but for me, weak emergentist requires a panpsychist substrate in order to get the weak emergence to work. So it's not like a hard and fast, oh, this just has to be right. It's it's a looking around at the theories and thinking, where's the what looks most plausible to me currently.
And why not think that instead of like some kind of proto-consciousness essence in the universe, that it is emergent from just some unknown part of physics that we just haven't discovered yet?
So
'Cause
why
it's
not think that it's just appearing from something that we don't know exists? Because that feels even less satisfactory to me. But maybe this is just around what kind of answers are satisfying. You just kind of said, what if it's something else that I can't point to? I guess it could be, but like you can't point to it, then I can't assess whether or not it's more plausible than the theory I've currently got.
Well, because to me, that seems to be like the typical progression of science, is that we start thinking something has some fundamental essence, fire, earth, air, and water, and then we discover later, nope, there's this other thing called fields, and the fields produce different interactions. The interactions produce things. We had absolutely no idea about that, couldn't even imagine it, but that is typically what always happens in science. Is something we can't imagine ends up being the solution, and our intuitions and our perceptions that feel good to us are typically always wrong. Just every single time we look into nature, they're always wrong. And so why not lean towards that being the case rather than leaning towards consciousness being the case?
Well, so I do think panpsychism is following the basic pattern of what you described typical science often does, though I do want to qualify that with actually there are lots of different types of explanations in science, and I think we have to be a bit careful when we say science typically explains things this way. We're kind of unifying what is a hugely complex, disparate, and exciting bunch of different, long history of different disciplines and methods. When we say it's very common to do, but I think we do need to be a bit more careful in using science in the singular in that way. But I do think that often it's claimed, and I think this is compelling, that when it looks at whether panpsychism could possibly ever count as a kind of scientific explanation, that the comparison with electromagnetic fields, that taking something that we thought just existed only at one level, and actually discovered that electromagnetism is more fundamental to reality than we ever previously realized, is exactly the kind of way that panpsychists are arguing about consciousness. We thought it only existed in this very complex way with kind of mammals or other complex organisms. Actually, it's this more fundamental thing, which then can help us explain its appearance in complex organisms. So I think there's actually a pattern there between the way electromagnetism has gone in the history of physics and the way panpsychism is suggesting that the science of consciousness might go.
So have you heard the argument against the natural supernatural distinction, that there's no real definition of what supernatural even means? Because like the further down you go in existence, as long as it exists, we're probably going to just describe it as natural, because that's kind of the only.
Yeah, I definitely think that so I would have said there's no definition of what natural means rather than supernatural, but I suppose you could put it either way. Yeah, I broadly speaking sympathetic to that problem. Yeah.
Well, I see a mirroring problem in the case of panpsychism versus physicalism, kind of a thing, where when we're trying to describe what it actually fundamentally is, we kind of just say, well, there's some fundamental essence of something down there, but it's as if we just actually finally discovered what the fundamental nature of reality is, we probably wouldn't be able to tell a difference one way or the other at that point, right? I mean, what is the fundamental way that we could define the difference between panpsychism and physicalism? Once we finally got down to that level, would it be the same kind of a problem that we see when trying to describe a difference between naturalism versus supernaturalism?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's exactly the same kind of problem, but I do think that so this is why I like to talk about psychophysical stuff, really, rather than maintain the dualism. So we have a dualism in our language because at least for currently, I don't know whether it's hardwired or whether it's a cultural kind of thing that we've all developed, but we do see the world in these kind of dualistic way. It's a dualistic intuition that people seem to have as children, and it's very hard to rid our language of that, if anything else. But I don't think of them as two separate things, right? So much like you're saying, I do think that ultimately it's going to be one type of stuff that we're looking at from two different angles. And maybe looking at it from two different angles is helpful. Maybe it ultimately won't be helpful. We'll see about that. But it is panpsychism is really a monist position, right? There's one type of stuff in the universe. It's just fundamentally one type of stuff, but that stuff both explains consciousness and matter. And I think you're right to point to like, is it really that different from materialism then? Well, some panpsychists are very happy to say, no, we're just insisting that materialism includes this claim. And you can still call it materialism, right? Like Galen Strawson, who I mentioned earlier. Yeah.
So my initial fundamental intuition is like, I have a cup. The cup is not conscious. I am conscious. And that seems to be my starting basis for why I don't like panpsychism, because it entails that everything is conscious, right? And that seems to be a massive bullet to bite, in a sense, that our current understanding of consciousness is so fundamentally wrong that when we perceive the laptop or the phone or the cup, none of these things seem conscious to us. But in the panpsychist view, they all have some essence of consciousness, some proto consciousness, something in them, and that seems to have such a massive bullet that you have to bite that goes against all of our basic intuitions, as opposed to something like materialism, that consciousness emerges in some sense. It's a combination that comes about, and prior to that, it's just not conscious. It's a rock. Why that? Would you agree that that's a massive bullet to bite? That's something that's very unintuitive for most people, that goes against our current understanding of consciousness to some degree?
Yeah, I'm perfectly comfortable as a panpsychist to say the cup isn't conscious and the laptop isn't conscious, right? And as we mentioned earlier, right, it's the fundamental stuff of the universe. There's nothing, unified about the cup. So, I think once people really grasp that aspect of panpsychist, that we're not asking you to say that the cup is conscious, or your slippers or whatever, then I think that huge bullet at least becomes a much smaller bullet, as it were, becomes much easier to bite off. Because when people think about the universe as a whole, I think a slightly more conscious-infused mysticism starts to become a bit more palatable, right? Because it's not just this ordinary object that we can throw against the wall or have relatively disregard for. We can destroy it, remake it, whatever, melt it down. When we're thinking about the unbelievably big, we have no idea yet how big, and apparently expanding universe, like then I think this bullet starts to become more manageable. And we're also not even, so some people are going to talk about, as we mentioned earlier with cosmopsychism, about the universe as a single whole. I'm not even going to do that. So I'm making the bullet even smaller again by talking about it in this more like quantum fieldy way, quarky way, right? These things that are very difficult for us to grasp on, to say that some modicum, some essence, as you call it, I'm not 100% sure about the language of essence, but I'm comfortable with it in a colloquial sense, of consciousness there. Then I think we know so little about that, and it appears so mysterious and quasi-mystical to us anyway. I think that becomes, in terms of people's intuitions, more manageable. But yes, the panpsychist has work to do to reassure people that we're not saying your laptop and your cup and your slippers are conscious. That you can absolutely hold on to your intuition. That they're not as as objects conscious.
Well, I think the intuition goes more than that. It seems like if panpsychism is true, then any sufficiently complex or aggregate collection of proto-conscious things are going to become conscious to some degree. So, like a star, let's say, a star is more complex than we are, and so it would have more of this proto-consciousness stuff than we do. So it should be conscious to some degree, maybe even more than we are. But we probably think intuitionally that's probably wrong. Probably not. Just accumulating a lot of the proto-consciousness stuff or the material stuff that makes up the universe doesn't seem to produce consciousness. It doesn't seem to be about the amount of essence stuff that we're adding together. It seems like there's some kind of pattern that needs to be there in order to produce consciousness. A brain neurological pathways that produce some kind of a system that produce consciousness in some way. And that seems to me to be the fundamental essence of what I think consciousness is the pattern in which the interaction is taking place. Whereas just the amount of stuff, fundamental stuff that you aggregate together doesn't seem to have anything to do with consciousness. It doesn't seem like whatever. I don't think it'll do anything. I don't think any stars or black holes are conscious. I don't think anything like that. But in the panpsychist view, it does seem to entail that a sufficient aggregation of matter would have a larger proto a larger aspect of consciousness than we do? If consciousness is fundamental, then stars should have more of the consciousness stuff than I do, right? Even, but it's not like.
So no, again, I said that earlier that consciousness unifies along, I think, probably along the lines of life. And so that pattern, that particular structure, which is integrated and unified, is going to be as essential on the panpsychist view as it is on the materialist view for what things as unified things count as conscious things. So I don't really know enough about stars, but my intuition is certainly that they're not conscious, that they're not alive, that they're not unified in a sufficiently complex way, even though they're really big, even though they've got lots of disunified bits of proto-conscious stuff. And I think that's important because otherwise we have a really difficult barrier about what counts as a barrier about what counts as a thing, as opposed to a collection of things, as opposed to where the barriers are between where does the star end, where does the star end, right? That's a good example because stars don't have very clearly defined edges. So I think it's living organisms which have boundaries which self-regulate, where we can start to talk about this unity, because unity also is coming with a barrier, as a distance of what counts as part of the unified organism and what doesn't. So I actually think that the panpsychist view can maintain all the intuitions that that we seem to share here, and many of the intuitions a materialist will have. It's just that this ingredient is in there from the beginning, and is riddled through everything. But what counts as a conscious thing is going to be broadly the same answer on a materialist view, I imagine, because that pattern, that structure is playing a hugely important role.
Oh yeah, I think the pattern and the structure is what consciousness is, as opposed to it being some part of the features of the pattern or what it's made of. So like, I think there wouldn't be a difference between a consciousness made of a biological brain versus a computer chip or whatever, as long as the pattern was the same. But when I think about the idea that it's part of the essence of the material being, whether it's a physical material or a spiritual material of some kind, that seems to grate on my intuitions a little bit, because it seems like there's more consciousness or proto-conscious. The amount of proto-consciousness in the sun is significantly more than the amount of consciousness in me, even though mine happens to be organized in a more productive manner in some sense. And that seems to be a very strange thought, that there's a large rock and there's more consciousness in there than there is in me, but it's just not organized in such a way that it can be produced into a conscious experience. Whereas to say that the pattern is the consciousness, that seems to make much more sense to me. It seems like if the pattern is the consciousness, then obviously there's no consciousness in the rock. There's nothing there, because the pattern is what you need for the consciousness. And that seems to make more sense to me when I think about it, of what consciousness could be, rather than trying to say it's some kind of property within the essence of the material that makes it up. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we're kind of getting down to our intuitions again, but yeah, I don't know what to say other than I find panpsychism more compelling because it has this kind of, what in Aristotelian terms, this material cause and this formal cause, right? So it is valuing the pattern and the structure as much, or at least very almost as much, as you are in the view you just outlined. But it's just adding in that the consciousness isn't the pattern. The pattern is unifying the proto-consciousness to create a complex thing. And that pattern is important, not just for like aggregation, but the way something is unified together is going to determine what kind of conscious being it is, right? What it's like to be that thing. So so it's still hugely important, which is why brain injuries will change someone's what it's like to be that person, what it's like to experience the world from that person's point of view, right? So changing the structure, the form, the pattern, as you call it, of the way the material is organized is going to change what it's like to be that thing, what it's like to be conscious for that thing, just as much on the panpsychist view as on the more materialist view you organized. I'm just adding in this. It's not, the pattern doesn't explain everything. There's something the pattern is patterning. It's something it's organizing. There's something that it's moving around. There's something right, that the pattern is made out of, and I think what it's made out of has to contain the ingredients of kind of this proto-consciousness. Otherwise, you're not going to. Otherwise, we're back to the kind of strong emergence magic problem.
Yeah, so like if you imagine God created two substances, one was exactly like our universe, and one was like just materialism with no consciousness stuff. But you put the same pattern in both. There would be consciousness in the stuff that ours, but there would not be in just the purely material stuff God made. In your view, correct?
Yeah, that's my argument, that you can't just, even if the patterns were exactly the same, the structure was the same, if there wasn't the ingredients, as it were, as I like to call them, then you wouldn't get there.
So that would make the second universe like a pea zombie kind of, where it's just
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
imitation consciousness.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's definitely, I think, a route for me to think about more about my argument to counter panpsychism. I'm obviously a physicalist, but I think that's a really interesting entailment, that it requires that there must be this logical possibility of pea zombies, where you can have a material universe that acts in the exact same way, exact same pattern, but it has no consciousness. That seems to be something I think I would disagree with. I don't think it can have the same pattern but no consciousness. I think that would be very strange. But we have been going for about 50 minutes. We have some questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, good question asked. Thank you for the super chat. Whales are conscious and they are enormous. Is the whale enormously more conscious than human genus?
So yeah, I don't think it's a mere matter of quantity, right? It's so drawing on things like integrated information theory from neuroscience, it's about the level to which the mind is integrated together, the brain specifically is integrated together. So having a big brain, if it's really well integrated and a really big brain, then it might be, in a sense, have a more complex conscious experience of the world than something else. But equally, it could be a very big brain that isn't as well organized, isn't as well integrated, at which point it's not. So it's not, size isn't the only thing that matters, I think, when it comes to
We're going to clip
brains
that
and
part, put
consciousness.
that part,
Yeah.
just that one sentence. All right. Thank you, Efont, for the super chat. Is Christianity and panpsychism compatible?
Yeah, I think absolutely. So I actually think there's more panpsychism, bits of and hints of and discussion of within the history of Christian thought than most people realize. And certainly, even if that wasn't true, so that's a historical claim, which I obviously can't defend quickly now. But even if that wasn't true, even if it was entirely new, I think they are completely compatible, right? So the story I like to tell that combines them, as it were, is that when God creates the universe, God creates a universe that has consciousness and materialness built in both from the beginning, and then that universe evolves and expands along the lines that the contemporary natural science tells us it does, and that God can be close to and loves and want to be in relationship with all of that universe, not just the humans. So I think that would be my kind of Christian panpsychist story. And then so when God saves the universe, God saves everything in the universe, everything that does exist and has ever existed. So in many ways, I'm expanding the scope of Christian salvation, and the love that God has for all material creation, beyond than what most people have typically been taught about Christianity. But I don't think I'm doing anything that oversteps Christianity or radically changes it. I think these two things are deeply compatible. Yeah.
Gotcha. Frank, thank you for the super chat. He asks, question for either: where is the cutoff point between what is conscious and what is not unconscious?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. In many ways, it's an empirical question, and one we don't know the answer to yet. My intuition, as I said, it's probably not much more than that, is to place it along the lines of when it counts as a thing as living and not living. And the more you learn about biology and chemical biology, the more you realize that that's a really difficult thing as well. So I think there's a gray area. I think there are things that we definitely think of as alive and things that we definitely think of as not alive, right? But there's sponges and viruses and things in the middle that are a little bit trickier. And so I think, just as there is with life, there's going to be this gray area with consciousness. But I'm going to put it in the same place.
Eves specifically asked that as well. Previously, do viruses have souls?
Yeah, we're taking consciousness and soul to be synonymous, and we think viruses are alive and they have some very basic form of consciousness. Then the answer will be yes, viruses have some basic form of soul.
Awesome. All right. Good question. Thank you for the super chat. He asked, panpsychism could be defined as disingenuous ways to shoehorn God and souls into reality. He asked a similar question about panpsychists say, I'm the best thing in the universe produced by my consciousness is fundamental to me, therefore consciousness is fundamental. I think this is one of the underlying criticisms of panpsychism, that it's like human-centric, that we're
Yeah.
trying to make our consciousness seem special in some way, and that's something that's been used throughout human history to argue for many, many things. We always wanna argue we're special, and many scientists say the opposite, that we're never special. We're never, ever special. And so what are your takes on these criticisms?
Yeah, I think there are different ways to be human-centric, anthropocentric, and there are different ways to mean specialness, and they're not all equal, right? So saying that we're the most important thing in the universe, and we're the only things that are conscious, and therefore we're the only things that matter because we're the only things that can experience the world around us. I think that's bad. And I just think panpsychism actually helps us overcome that by saying, no, we're not the only things that are conscious. We're not the only things that are special in the sense of having consciousness. So it's got this strange, I absolutely agree with you. It's got this strange, like, in one sense, it's taking the human experience and making that writ large, which appears in one sense very human centric. In another sense, it's taking away our the thing that more than anything else in the history of philosophy and theology has been used to make us special. So it's got this and showing that we're not that different. Actually, everything has this. So it's got this strange balance of the position of the human, which I do think is just a kind of fascinating, like different thing to the way most of Western thought has gone, which has actually been to reverse those. So,
Got a question from Eves. He says, "Where did God get the ingredients to create His first creation?" Because I think before we both have this idea that something from nothing, strong emergence, popping out of nothing, is very weird. It's not something we agree with. And how is God creating things any different than that?
yeah. So, and this is the reason that I think you need something like a God, right, that is transcendent, that is not like the rest of the creation, because I think the magic, the something out of nothing, doesn't work in creation, right? That's not how creation works within this universe. But by positing God at all, you're positing a being that is beyond the universe, or if you're positing a traditional theistic God, you're positing a God that's beyond the universe, a God that doesn't need ingredients in which to make things. And I know that in arguments back and forth on this kind of cosmological argument, how did God create the universe? What was his ingredients? What did he do beforehand? Was he lonely? All those sorts of questions that come up. The atheistic side often says that you're just the theist is just special pleading when it comes to God, and the theist is just going to say, well, it's principle special pleading, right? I know consciously I'm deliberately not talking about anything that's like anything else. And if I thought I didn't need that, then I wouldn't use it. But actually, the theist says, I think I do need that. I think I do need to have this being that is beyond being, this being that the rules of explanation don't apply to, and that we have this personal agential explanation rather than a material explanation, to take it back to this question about the ingredients. And I don't think these arguments are like, I think these arguments are important as defenses of a view. I don't think they're powerful as arguments that move people from one view to the other very often. But I think it's important that they are rational defenses of one's own position, and that's what I think. I think the cosmological argument is a rational defense of the theist's position.
Turing Test asks, "Are antivirals murder?"
Murder is an ethically laden term, right? It's a particular kind of killing. So antivirals, if they kill a living thing, i.e. viruses, then it's a kind of killing. I wouldn't call that a kind of murder because I don't think it has the ethical connotations that the word murder carries.
But I think it leads to an interesting question of like, if all living things are alive and conscious, from my moral view, I think killing anything ever for any reason is immoral. I think that a perfectly moral universe, it would be impossible to kill or force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. And so killing anyone for any reason on my worldview is immoral. And so if viruses were alive, had consciousness, and you killed them, then that would be immoral on my worldview and some many others. And so from that kind of perspective,
So but the consciousness bit there appears more central, right, than the alive bit, because you presumably think that lots of things are alive that we kill,
right. But
but you don't think they're conscious, right?
right. But if we took like the idea that panpsychism was true and everything has some kind of proto consciousness to it, and I was any kind of consciousness from my perspective has moral significance, even the proto consciousness. And so interfering with the proto consciousness without its consent, or if it had some meaningful level of proto consciousness, it would be immoral to kill it. And so, if I was a panpsychist, I would say harming anything ever, taking my extreme view of morality, would be immoral.
Yeah, so as I said, I have a more gradient view of moral responsibility and its connection to consciousness than it sounds like you do. And I certainly don't think just because something's consciousness, it has the capacity to give consent. I think consent is a very high functioning level of conscious capacity that very few organisms in the universe have in terms of species. So if it's consent you're worried about, then it's not going to, even on the panpsychist view, at least the one that I hold, it's not going to apply to, it's going to apply to humans for the most part, and if not all, and maybe some other species. But again, I mean, what counts and what sorts of cognitive or conscious capacities you can have for consent is different to me than just the capacity to know what it's like to be alive, to be you, right? That we're talking about quite different things between consciousness and consent.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that something can be conscious without the ability to consent, in which case it would be immoral to interfere with it. So if it can't give consent, you shouldn't be able to do anything to it morally. Perfect universe, you can't touch it unless it consents, kind of a thing.
Yeah, so I don't, and just to be clear, I don't agree that it's immoral to kill anything that's conscious, right? I think that because consciousness comes in degrees. So yeah.
Gotcha. All right, that we've been going for about an hour. Really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Yeah, sure. So the book that I developed most of this thinking on is called Minding Creation. It's published by Bloomsbury, T&T Clark, and there's a nice cheap paperback for kind of just over 20 quid, I think. And I've written some articles. One that will be open access is called Panpsychism and God, and that looks at panpsychism's compatibility with a whole different variety of stances about the existence of God, or gods, or pantheism, or atheism, and whatnot. Yeah, so they're the main two things on this topic. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks again. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.